You are watching an in-depth look at the collegiate sports industry in America. Its existence alone has drawn the attention of some of the biggest media outlets in the world. Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, as well as a number of independent outlets. College athletics has also drawn the attention of countless scholars. Their statistics and analysis will paint the whole picture of how this industry operates for better and for worse. It starts with a simple fact. America loves college sports. One look at the most watched sports games of 2019 will tell you that. The top 10 most watched games were absolutely dominated by the NFL. But in at number 11 wasn't baseball or basketball, it wasn't hockey or soccer, but college football. The NBA didn't even have the most watched basketball game. College basketball did. Yet despite the popularity, the industry and the NCAA are plagued by scandal after scandal after scandal. American college athletics are in a unique place in the business world where they're popular enough to be worth billions of dollars and pay their workers nothing. If you love college basketball, you know the University of North Carolina dominated the last several decades and have a number of titles to show for it. If college football is your game, you know Alabama has been the team to beat for almost 10 years, and before them it was the Miami Hurricanes and their greatest roster of all time. Even casual sports fans know these universities. That's because we tend to remember the dynasties better than we do the downfalls. Do you remember the UNC fake classes scandal? Or some of their stars accepting cash from agents? Do you know the bribery and corruption that eventually ended the Miami U dynasty? Why can't players accept money from agents they eventually sign with? Why can't they accept money from endorsements but coaches can? These are all things we're going to be talking about. But there are two questions I think everyone should consider as we look into collegiate athletics. First, what is the purpose of colleges and universities? Is it education or profit, classrooms or locker rooms? Secondly, why do we even have college sports to begin with? Of all the sources on intercollegiate athletics, one stood out for how often it was cited by mainstream media and online journalists. It's called the Knight Commission. The Knight Commission is a panel of professors, researchers, and athletes from around the nation. NBA Hall of Famer David Robinson is on the Knight Commission today, but it has a long history. He was drafted into the NBA the same year this commission met for the first time. It's old. Sorry, David. They were concerned back in 1989 about the way colleges were treating athletes and what was happening to education. They found that in just the 1980s, over 100 colleges and universities were censured, sanctioned, or put on probation by the NCAA. A survey of pro football players revealed 1/3 of them were paid in college, and over half saw nothing wrong with that. The Knight Commission quoted another organization with similar concerns, called the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. The Carnegie Foundation said of collegiate athletics, quote, "Recruiting had become corrupt, professionals replaced amateurs, education was being neglected, and commercialism reigned." They said this in 1929, back when washing machines and Irish immigrants were new to the country. Movies were silent. The Great Depression was about to kick off. The world was recovering from the war to end all wars. And just 10 years later, what entered the second? War to end all wars. Almost 100 years have gone by, and we're still finding widespread corruption in the college sports system. Is recruiting less corrupt today than in 1929? Are amateurs not paid under the table anymore? Is education now fixed? Is the game less commercial since 1929? No. This is where I think the way we look at college sports is wrong. We say it's something in need of repair and reform. Repair and reform for the last 100 years? We need more time to repair and reform the same problems?
We need more time. Time's up.
We should look at it as a system that needs to be eliminated. And the reason why starts with the Football Bowl subdivision. What is the Football Bowl subdivision, or FBS? It is the NFL of college sports. 130 of the most watched schools in the most watched conferences making the most money. If you watch a nationally televised college game, it's an FBS school that's competing. Is your college in the ACC, Big East, Big 12, SEC? All Football Bowl subdivision schools. But keep in mind that doing so also shows the school's doing the best financially. So you may look at those numbers and think athletic finances are doing better than they really are. But because there is no TV money outside the FBS, every other college in the country has to take money from classrooms to fund the athletic teams, called a subsidy. More on that later. The important thing to know now is that there's even something wrong with the finances of those top FBS schools, which former Domino's Pizza CEO and current athletic director at University of Michigan discusses in an interview.
The business model of big-time college athletics is primarily broken. It's a horrible business model.
Broken. Let's talk about why that is. According to Knight Commission figures, in 2018, schools in the FBS, and remember, that's only about 130 schools, spent $1.1 billion on athletic scholarships, $1.88 billion on facilities and equipment, $1.56 billion on coaches, $1.57 billion on the rest of the staff and administrative positions. The first disparity you should see looking at those numbers, $1.1 billion on athletes, but $1.56 billion on coaches. There are no professional leagues where a team spends more on the coach than on the team. If the richest team in the NBA, the Los Angeles Lakers, spent as much on coaches as players, Frank Vogel and every one of his 7 assistants would make $20 million a year. Athletic student aid, the compensation student athletes receive, 13% of the budget. For reference, the current collective bargaining agreement between the NFL and its players' union states that players as a whole must receive at least 47% of league revenue. But college athletes cannot get paid. This is what allows NCAA schools to build massive facilities pro teams can't afford. They don't have to pay athletes. But worse than not paying them is this. The cost of scholarships and meal plans for hundreds of athletes is less than the salaries of the handful of people coaching them. And it's not just coaches. As we'll get into, athletic spending is absurdly high on virtually everyone and everything except the athletes.
Show me the money! Show me the money!
Here's the money. From 2012 to 2017, FBS median football spending went up 20% a year, but median academic spending went up 8% every year at the same schools. That represents a serious priority shift from academics to athletics across the entire FBS. Remember big question number 1. What is the purpose of colleges? In order to better understand how college sports created this problem, we need to understand how it happened. And for that, we go back to Michigan's athletic director.
And that's where the phrase arms race comes up.
If you don't keep pace, if you don't stay competitive, you're going to have a problem.
The arms race is what happens when a few schools that can afford it increase their spending to get ahead of the rest of the country, and the many schools that cannot afford it increase their own spending anyway to keep pace. The consequences for this arms race are stark. According to the NCAA's own numbers, schools in the FBS lost more money than they made, with one school losing as much as $65 million in just 1 year. Additionally, only a little more than 20 schools have a self-sustaining athletic department, and that is not talking about the D1 programs at those 130 schools in the FBS. That includes every athletic program in the country.
125 of these programs, out of 125, 22 of them were cash flow even or cash flow positive.
There's this idea most Americans have that college sports makes a lot of money, and that's true. But there's a huge difference between making a ton of money and being profitable. College sports is not a profitable business, and that's without even paying the players.
Oh, pay me! Pay me, bitch!
But the biggest takeaway from this chart is also the smallest. It's that tiny gray portion, barely bigger than the white lines dividing the sections. Representing half a percentage point, it is called excess transfers back. This is when a college takes extra money made by the athletic department and contributes it to the academic side of the house. It's football and basketball dollars paying for classrooms, and it is extremely rare. Athletic departments, like their colleges, are nonprofits, meaning any profit they make must be reinvested to balance the books. But athletic departments don't want to invest in education. They want to reinvest in football and basketball, because that's what their rivals do. And this is an arms race. When they do invest back into education, it's typically a one-time payment rather than an annual contribution. Those 129 FBS schools make almost $8.8 billion. The revenues here are divided into sections you might recognize from professional teams: ticket sales, TV money, corporate sponsors and advertising, other, which is anything from parking to hot dogs to investments. Then there's income unique only to college sports, government support, student fees, donor contributions, and competition guarantees. See, athletic departments in colleges that supposedly run them are essentially nonprofit charities. Contributions from alumni are tax deductible, like money to the Salvation Army to feed the hungry. Except instead of feeding the hungry or educating the poor, these tax-deductible contributions are used for new uniforms or practice fields or nicer stadiums. Speaking of taxes, almost $1 billion in revenues
$1 billion. Gentlemen,
for just those 130 FBS schools in just the year 2018, just for the athletic department, came from tax dollars. So you as a taxpayer are paying for the games. Over $500 million comes from student fees. So if you're a student, you pay for the athletic department with no benefit to yourself, since most schools make you pay for tickets as well. And if you're a student with a part-time job, you're paying twice.
what?
Now, the two biggest items on revenues for schools are also the two that athletic departments are built for: TV money and donor contributions. But here's the thing about donor contributions. It's not just money donated by alumni and earmarked for sports, like a former student donating money for a new locker room. It's sport-specific contributions, plus any other donations the school wants to throw towards the athletic department. That former student could just as easily intend to contribute money towards a library, and instead watch it pulled into a stadium renovation. But here's a bigger question. Why are universities putting money towards stadiums in the first place?
That doesn't make sense.
Colleges spend more money on their athletes than on academics, but what's surprising is how much more. The Delta Cost Project crunched the numbers for schools competing in the NCAA's Division I. We're talking the big guys. And when you add up the cost of scholarships, coaches' salaries, travel, all the rest, the Southeastern Conference spends about $164,000 per athlete.
There is a big and widening gap between what colleges spend on students for student athletes. This chart shows in blue spending per athlete, in green spending per student, and in red subsidy per athlete, which we'll get into later. We have the FBS, non-FBS schools, and schools without a football team. But take a look at the blue line versus the green line. From 2005 to 2010, they all spent 3 to 8 times more on athletes than students. But that gap's getting bigger, and it's doing so at a faster rate. Are you at a school that's spending 5, 6, or 12 times more on athletes than on students? Are you paying for that in student fees? Is that how you think your money and your tax dollars should be used? Students are being put at a relative disadvantage in terms of investment compared with their athletic counterparts. Given that, do you still think universities are focused on education? If so, consider this. Those numbers have only gone up since 2010. In 2010, the biggest conferences spent over $100,000 per student athlete, which is 8 to 12 times what was spent on students. More recently, it's not just the SEC anymore. The disparity is common among top conferences, and there's also disparity within athletic departments between football and everyone else. Over 20 universities now spend over $200,000 per football player. Alabama, 10 Auburn, schools Texas, spend more than that, not Tech, per Florida, player, FSU, LSU, BMS, Clemson, Penn State, State corrections. Given the disparity between when researchers dive into their numbers on FBS far more on football, is to measure the pulse, evidence of that, the heart rate of the most 2018 Alabama and Georgia played for the National Football Championship. Both teams spent between $300,000 to $350,000 on every football player on their roster. The point of this isn't just to cram numbers into your head. Is to show two things. First, that these nonprofit colleges are operating like private businesses. Second, that trend is increasing. The richest schools and the richest conferences can get away with spending this much money and sometimes break even. But what about the rest of the thousands of athletic departments in the country? The majority of FBS schools and virtually every university outside the FBS need to subsidize.
We're going to need to find ways to subsidize my work.
A subsidy is typically defined as money coming from a government entity for a public good like buses, trains, roads, parks. One definition identifies a subsidy as money for something that the free market doesn't deliver. But no matter which definition you like best, each has to be significantly distorted to include college sports, which is not a free public good and is already delivered by the private sector. Hello, NFL. Worse than that, the subsidy comes from money that was set aside for higher education, taking from the academic budget to cover the operating losses of the athletic department. Some universities do it more than others. These are subsidies per student athlete out of the total spent per student athlete and the percentage that represents. In the case of Western Michigan, their sports revenues only pay for 22% of their athletics cost, less than 1/4. To find the overall cost of subsidizing athletics, you only need to multiply the first number by the total number of student athletes. That final tally can get into the tens of millions of dollars annually for some of these schools. But that cost gets passed on to students and taxpayers, which can mean up to $6,000 or more charged to you for the privilege of going to a school with athletics teams.
They have canceled 17 of their academic programs, but they have retained their sports programs.
Here's another kicker. Most schools use accounting tactics to hide the amount they're spending. There's a rule of accounting called the Nakubo rule, which attempts to make public spending as transparent as possible. But only a few states actually follow that rule. Universities in those states tend to be the ones that rank highest in amount of money taken from students for athletics, but it's not because they necessarily charge the most. It's because they're forced to be more honest about it. Because of how few states follow that rule, odds are if you're watching this, you attend or attended a university that does not follow the Nakubo rule, which means you pay far more for university sports than you thought. In the end, you may like your school's team, and you may love going to the game. That's your choice. But when the costs are imposed on all students and the university tries to hide it as much as possible, you don't really have a choice. And when every college in the country takes money from your pocket to pay for it, you really don't have a choice. Subsidies are one of the worst parts of the collegiate sports game. They directly impact students, and as the Knight Commission data and NBC reports show, it's not just a few colleges that are the problem. If every university in the nation were required to disclose their full financial information, we might see that every state college charged students like you thousands of dollars, not for your education, but for a sports team you might not even watch. But the broken business model doesn't end there. It also shows up in coaches' compensation.
It's professional in every way, and the NCAA has acknowledged, Miles Brand acknowledged that in the early 2000s. Yep. That's when they came up with collegiate model.
Right.
Collegiate model means...
That's just a phrase.
They made it up to say, we're professional, but the players are not.
There is an incredible hypocrisy in recognizing coaches are professional, providing them a salary, while simultaneously maintaining players are amateurs. But being professional in an amateur league has its perks. The Atlantic published a report showing coaches' salary has increased 750% since 1984. Professors' pay increased just 32% in the same period. Again, what is the mission of the university? USA Today released a report showing that the average FBS football coach salary is $2.67 million, while the average basketball coach makes over $1 million a year. A professor's top salary is around 1/10 what these coaches are making. Yet these institutions exist for education. Some of these figures don't include all the extra concessions coaches get, like a share of ticket revenues, country club memberships, private jet use, or a free house. Literally.
Boosters at Alabama paid off Nick Saban's mortgage on his house just because they wanted to.
Soaring salaries and friendly booster clubs aren't the only benefit these coaches get. Most that are hired to big athletic departments get benefits like severance packages worth millions of dollars. In 2014, Auburn University paid Gus Malzahn $4.3 million to coach the football team. That same season, Auburn also paid Gene Chizik and 3 assistants, former coaches, a combined $4.1 million to not coach its football team. That year, Auburn also paid $400,000 to former baseball coach John Pulowski, fired May 2013, and paid $2.4 million to former men's basketball coach Tony Barbie, fired in May 2014. That's the effect of severance packages. But back to salary. Here's a fun fact. Did you know that coaches are actually state employees? Here's another. In over 2/3 of the U.S., a college football or basketball coach is the highest paid state employee. The yellow on this map indicates that the highest paid employee is a college football coach. Orange indicates a basketball coach. Blue states have literally anyone else as the highest paid state employee. And this data is from 2013. To update these numbers, Nevada and New York, formerly blue states, are now yellow. The fact that the average pay for these FBS coaches is millions of dollars is a major loophole to state finances when you consider the average state government employee, the people pensions were intended for, don't bring in much more than $50,000 a year. Now you may question why I bring up state finances and when it's the school paying the salary and alumni boosters providing additional benefits. As state employees, coaches are eligible for pensions. Joe Paterno, for example, had a taxpayer-funded pension valued at $13.4 million.
Vincent, we happy? Yeah, we happy.
If tax dollars are intended to be spent in some form to the benefit of taxpayers, where's the benefit to pensions for college coaches? Are they providing a societal benefit that justifies being included in the pension system? Especially those in the FBS making anywhere from $1 million to $10 million a year? Let's talk about those high salaries. Compared to, say, the professionals, since obviously professional sports is more commercialized than college. Coach K, top paid basketball coach in the nation, makes around $9 million a year, which would place him third in the NBA. John Calipari makes $8 million a year, which would place him at fourth or fifth if you include Coach K. Pretty good for a nonprofit. Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban make around $9 million each, which would make them the fifth and sixth highest paid coaches in the NFL. Pretty good for a nonprofit. Defenders of the collegiate athletics system often justify this by saying it's the outcome of a free market. Tell that to the players on the field. The whole reason the NFL doesn't broadcast Saturdays is because of a law Congress passed to protect college football. Not paying players is backed up by court precedent. This market is anything but free. As far as individuals go, coaches are the epitome of commercialization in college sports. Yet college coaches aren't the biggest expense. Facilities are.
Universities are selling themselves out, no longer about education. Flat sold out those cameras over there. Athletics, football is, as I said, is sold out for.
Selling out is when the Chicago Tribune finds that in 2014, 48 schools spent almost $800 million on athletics facilities, double what they spent in 2004, accounting for inflation. Selling out is the University of California spending over $300 million just to renovate the stadium. This is what they mean when they say sports building binge.
Universities are in the midst of a sports building binge. Cal Berkeley, for example, renovated its stadium to the tune of $321 million.
The most visible result of the massive spending increases that we see in college sports is in facilities. Add in our previously identified arms race to an industry hell-bent on building expensive things, and you come up with some ridiculous buildings.
Look at the locker room for the LSU football players. Every single one of those locker rooms, those lockers, is a first-class suite pod that they have because they wanted to. The Clemson facility has a nap room and a putt-putt facility because they wanted to put the money in.
They are referring to a $55 million football-only hangout complex featuring sand volleyball courts, laser tag, mini golf, bowling lanes, barbershops, a pool, basketball courts, and more. In 2013, the University of Tennessee built a $45 million gym for the football team. It has a 2-story weight room, hydrotherapy room, theater for team meetings, and a water wall. The Maryland Terps converted a former basketball arena to an indoor football practice field for $155 million, and they wanted $25 million in state taxes to help build it. Nike co-founder and Oregon alumni Phil Knight helped build a reported $138 million athletic complex for his alma mater. It has a 170-seat theater, a weight room, cafeteria, barbershop, saunas, lounges, and more. After the University of Colorado at Boulder finished a $156 million indoor football practice field, a member of their board of regents spoke out, and in doing so encapsulated the problem with the lavish spending. He said, quote, It's a never-ending arms race to build shiny objects that appeal to 17-year-olds, so they'll pick us instead of somebody else. End quote. Professor Gurney of the Drake Group was quoted by the Washington Post as saying the spending has, quote, nothing to do with the mission of a university, end quote. He called it an embarrassment and asked if something ridiculous like a lazy river was next. Here's another view of it and the problem I see with the amount spent on athletes, especially revenue sport athletes, versus everybody else. Oregon, with a mix of funding, built a $138 million facility for athletes, and in reality for the football team. An overhaul of the school library in 1994 cost $27 million, or over $50 million accounting for inflation. But one of these facilities is only used by a few hundred athletes. The other has been used by hundreds of thousands of students and faculty. In other words, Oregon directed 3 times as much money to a few hundred athletes as they did to hundreds of thousands of students. If you want to see an organization's priorities, don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
And there is no clearer way to gauge priorities than by following the money. Example. The Auburn Athletic Department ran a $17 million deficit in 2014, meaning the school, aka students and taxpayers, had to bail them out for $17 million. Yet that same year, they approved the funds for a $90 million basketball practice arena, a $23 million indoor football practice field, and a $17.7 million soccer and track facility. They willingly accepted larger debts to academics in order to provide more funding to athletics. The University of California had $0 in annual athletics mortgages in 2005. In 2015, just 10 years later, that became $23 million a year. The University of Wisconsin spent their way from $10.5 million to $38 million in athletics mortgages annually during roughly the same period.
What?
But let's look more at these market inefficiencies. According to the Chronicle of Higher Education, the NCAA's top 6 sports conferences raised more than $3.9 billion, that's with a B, for new sports facilities from roughly 2010 to 2015.
It's just shows kind of the market inefficiencies that all these facilities are being built for 2 reasons. One is recruiting, and the other is to enhance performance.
Correct.
That's all it is.
Yep.
Market inefficiency is a good term for the kind of spending we see from colleges because in many ways, despite being a collection of nonprofit teams run by a nonprofit organization, they often take on bigger expenditures than the professionals. Here's an example of what happens when you take market inefficiencies and add them to an athletics arms race. In 2014, Texas A&M unveiled what was the largest jumbotron not only in college sports, but one of the largest in the nation. The school ordered it to be slightly larger than the one at college rival University of Texas. Less than a year later, SEC rival Auburn temporarily took the lead in this arms race by debuting an almost 11,000 square foot Goliath. And apparently this measuring contest is not uncommon. The vice president of Daktronics, a South Dakota company that builds the video boards, has had conversations with college officials at multiple schools who cite the size of rivals' boards when they place an order, because apparently size really does matter. As of 2015, around 10 college teams had jumbotrons over 6,000 square feet. To put that in perspective, Texas A&M would have had a larger jumbotron than over half the NFL at the time, and Auburn would have been second only to the Dallas Cowboys. If you still feel it's appropriate for colleges to fund athletics departments, how far from university mission statements should they be allowed to stray? A college president says, okay, we're going to fund a sports team. It will raise awareness for the school, maybe, more on that later. It's a good education for athletes, no, more on that later. And it could increase revenues for the academic side of the house, no, as you saw in excess transfers back. As taxpayers and students, we've accepted this system for the last 100 years. The difference is, today that college president says, we're going to take on some debt because the team's not profitable now, but it will be. We need to be more competitive, so we're purchasing private jets for recruiting. We need to keep pace, so we're going tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into debt for a new stadium. This team's really important, so we're going tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into debt for a practice facility.
Practice? We're talking about practice, man.
They're still not profitable, so now we need student fees from you and tax dollars from your parents. Here's some more examples of what untethered athletic spending looks like. Auburn bought 2 twin-engine jets solely for recruiting. When asked if buying this was a little overboard, they responded that it was a common asset for teams at the top of the FBS. At Ohio State, coaches can use their team's private jet for recruiting or personal use. The Ohio State men's and women's ice hockey teams practice on a $75,000 treadmill that professional teams like the Anaheim Ducks said they couldn't afford. Oregon University received a $100 million gift from Nike co-founder Phil Knight, but they're going to pocket that and request tax dollars for a $200 million basketball arena. And where does this fit into a university mission statement?
That's why for Michigan's home opener, Brandon brought in a stealth bomber to help kick off the game.
The bottom line is this. Even if you believe that college sports is an acceptable endeavor for a public university, how far is too far?
You've got 125 of these programs. Out of 125, 22 of them were cash flow even or cash flow positive.
There's a misconception most college sports fans believe, that it's profitable. It's not. This chart shows revenues and expenses for the nation's top 5 conferences. Revenues doubled, but high spending kept profits the same. Another chart shows that about 20 teams broke even in 2004, and again only 20 did in 2014. But that's after doubling revenues. Nearly everyone raised spending from 2004 to 2014, but not everyone kept up in terms of revenues. This is statistical evidence of the arms race theory, and it's evidence of something else. Colleges don't spend more money based on what they make. They spend money based on what their rivals are doing. If significantly less than half of teams in the top 5 conferences are breaking even, what does that tell you about the rest of NCAA sports? I could close my eyes and pick a team to see the impact of this spending, but here are a few examples. University of Virginia now institutes some of the highest student fees in their conference, almost double the FBS average. University of Arizona increased revenues by almost $30 million, yet maintain an $8 million annual deficit. That's $8 million every year taken from their classrooms. Same story at Arizona State University, except they almost doubled their revenues, but somehow still managed to find themselves in an annual deficit of $13 million. But what about the schools that make it, whose programs become wildly popular? Texas A&M rose to the top tier of football revenues in a very short time. Unfortunately, even in the case of a university's dream scenario, in which the football team not only breaks even, but makes almost $50 million in a single year, not a dime was contributed back to the university.
I want some more.
As a matter of fact, almost no athletic department makes excess transfers back to their parent school. Alabama, Auburn, Arkansas, Oklahoma, California, Texas A&M, name a university. In this game, the money flows one way, towards the locker rooms. Part of this is a result of the whole nation trying to keep up with Alabama, Texas, and LSU. Who can afford to even consider sending money back into the classroom when competitors are constantly increasing their athletic budget every year? There lies the problem with the system today. It's not built for the university, not for students or faculty or to financially support education. It's built for coaches, it's built for advertisers, and it's built for donors. You've heard about the FBS, its revenues and expenses, its coaches, its facilities, and the arms race. Now it's time to talk about what happens when all those factors converge. Rutgers. Their athletics have been losing money since the 1980s, but the amount lost has increased enormously. In total, from 2004 to 2013, Rutgers athletics lost the school anywhere from $250 million to over $300 million. In 2018, their college president admitted that the department lost at least $193 million since 2013. That means since just 2004, Rutgers athletics lost the school over $500 million. But Rutgers athletics have been losing money annually since the 1980s. If this trend continues into the 2020s, which seems extremely likely, Rutgers could have the great distinction of having the first athletic department with $1 billion in losses.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them.
How did they get there? By going all in. In 2009, they expanded the stadium to help balance the budget. They were supposed to raise funds and donations, but when that didn't pan out, they decided to go through with the cost anyway and borrow all $100 million. 9 years later, they still owed around $80 million. Guess what that expense didn't do? Balance the budget. In the early 2000s, Rutgers spent $12.5 million to renovate the football weight room and soon after cut 6 sports from the department. Does that sound like valuing student athletes? Or does it sound like valuing revenues? Earlier, we talked about subsidies. These athletic department losses don't just disappear. They require subsidies to cover. In 2013 to 2014, the school subsidized the athletic department with almost $50 million. In 2018, it was $33 million. You might ask, why does this matter? All these schools, all this money. Well, as it turns out, stealing from academics to pay for athletics has a cost. According to its own faculty, Rutgers ranked first in their conference in underpaid part-time faculty, next to last in full-time faculty, and dead last in grad student support.
I'm not joking. This is my job.
So Rutgers has less professors, and the ones they do have are underpaid part-timers. But an important thing to note is it's not just Rutgers. If money comes from the academic budget to keep the athletics department afloat, the academic budget loses something tangible. New research won't be conducted. New academic buildings will be put off. Another part-time professor will get hired to teach full-time hours. A graduate assistant will teach a class for experience. New equipment won't be bought, and investments on behalf of students in class will get postponed. Their solution? More student fees, more subsidies. But the story of Rutgers isn't really about Rutgers. It's about every other school in the country that do the same things. Athletic departments at just 13 schools have long-term debt of over $150 million each. In 2011, only 3 schools were willing to say fuck education and subsidize their sports with over $25 million. In 2017, a dozen schools did that, and some of them are regular offenders. The University of California, Berkeley's debt skyrocketed as they tried to build a successful athletic department. The result? The largest long-term debt in college sports, and it's not even close. They have annual debt payments of $18 million right now, but in 2032, when the people who made this decision retire, that number is set to increase to $26 million annually. Their payments will peak at $37 million in the year 2039, when the people at Cal that actually borrowed this money have all died. But the school has plans to pay the full sum of the loan by 2053, when their grandchildren become forced laborers to help pay it off. If Cal has financial troubles, however, no worries. They don't have to pay the loan until its end year, 2112. On top of all the finance, there's a dirty little secret to college sports that began in 2009 and continued through 2016. Game attendance is down. It's down across all FBS schools, and even down slightly among those top 5 conferences. The reason? Some steep drop-offs in attendance among former contenders. Kansas attendance dropped 50% during that period. Western Michigan, a school we mentioned earlier due to subsidies, never filled its costly stadium. So colleges are building more, spending more, and actually seeing attendance level off and in some cases shrink. Yet they still act as if
God himself could not sink this ship.
Luckily, there's no way the athletics revenue can shrink. There's certainly no circumstances anyone can envision
Coronavirus officially hitting the U.S. Here's what we know.
The first death from coronavirus here in the United States.
First of all, I mean, as we know, the World Health Organization just declared this a global health emergency.
The coronavirus now has 1 in 4 Americans living in lockdown.
Every American has a role to play in defending our nation from this invisible, horrible enemy. So we say stay at home and save lives.
It's hard to measure the impact of COVID-19 on the collegiate sports world because the data isn't out yet. But make no mistake, this is devastating for college finances, particularly at those schools that went all in on sports. College football was restricted and saw several cancellations. March Madness 2020 was canceled and 2021 is in the air. In the coming years, there is no way of telling if colleges will even be allowed to bring fans back in, let alone fill a stadium. Bottom line, everybody is suffering. But when the budget of your industry looks like this, where almost 20% of your money comes from ticket sales, almost 10% from advertising, including stadium ads no one's seeing anymore. Donor contributions that make up 20% of your revenues are often solicited with special in-team access that no longer exists. Those donors' businesses are suffering. Add all that up and you now have at least 50% of your revenue stream at risk or outright eliminated. That's to say nothing of decreased TV viewership, canceled games, and unknown rules for next season. Basically, college sports as a money-making machine is getting a huge wake-up call all across the country. It has been used to fund non-revenue sports, which are now getting canceled at a number of schools. But don't forget about this headline. This is the opportunity buried in the chaos for these athletic directors. They will cut sports that don't make them money in order to send more funds to football and basketball. Will colleges decrease their athletic department budgets? It's very possible that they will decrease what they can, but there's a number of annual athletics expenses that universities will have to grapple with, regardless of if there's a season or not. You can't cut the pay of a coach, they have to voluntarily agree to that. Mortgages for stadiums and other facilities aren't an expense they can wish away. And as we just went over, that can be an enormous expense. I would predict colleges and universities to cut academic spending, raise student fees, increase subsidies, and introduce new fees to cover their losses. If you're a college student listening to this, take a look at your tuition statement when you go back to school. The college presidents that use this crisis to raise profitability will be the ones getting major pay raises in the coming years. We are done with college finances. Done. Unfortunately, and really, I am sorry, we're not done with numbers. I've answered the what, when, where, and how of college sports, but it's time to answer the why. Why does a college president allow coaches to steal from professors? Across the country, for institutions, both public and private, college presidents and athletic directors give the same defenses for huge investments in sports.
It's like winning. I'm by winning. I win here and I win there. Now what?
They say winning increases alumni donations, increases applications, and improves applicant quality. Our earlier Michigan athletic director was confident that football was responsible for a majority of donations.
Folks have actually done statistical research on how much of the giving takes place during football season, and it's a disproportionate amount.
Disproportionate how much?
I think the number is somewhere between 60 and 70%.
Pretty easy to explain the timing of donations. Football season begins in August and ends in January. 5 months. So roughly 60 to 70%, if he is correct, of donations are given during roughly 40% of the year, which seems significant until you remember what also begins in January. Donations are almost all tax deductible.
Best of all, it's all charity, so it's tax-free.
But more importantly, does the research support the claims by college presidents and athletic directors? To answer that question, I looked at dozens of studies on the relationship between athletics and alumni donations, applications, and applicant quality. First on donations. Don't forget that is 20% of the typical FBS budget, even larger than ticket sales. One of the earliest studies on the relationship between athletics and alumni donations was almost 90 years ago in 1934. March studies 32 schools, 16 built football programs, and 16 did not. The universities that stayed away from football got more donations. Cutlip, 1965, donations and enrollments were unaffected by athletic success. Spaeth and Greeley, 1970, speculated that a winning football team might increase donations, but didn't actually test their theory.
They've done studies, 60% of the time, it works every time.
Amder, 1971, winning programs increased donations. Springer, 1974, 35 years of universities dropping football programs, and found that doing so had no negative effects on donations. Budig, 1976, looked at 79 institutions and found that connections between athletic success and donations were infrequent and random enough that he could not define the link. Siegelman and Carter, 1979, 138 D1 institutions, found no relationship. Brooker and Castoria, 1981, 58 institutions, strong connections between athletic success and donations in certain situations, but might not be enough to justify the overall investment. Andrew Mellon Database conducted surveys in 1951, 1967, and 1989, and found no evidence that athletic success increases donations. Harrison Mitchell Peterson, 1995, 18 universities, no connection between having a D1 sports program and donations. Goff, 2000, wanted to know if unexpected football success, the underdog reaches the championship story, increases donations. Based on Georgia Tech in 1990 and Northwestern in the 1995 Rose Bowl, the answer is no. Rhodes and Gherking, 2000, found that donations increased 7% when a school won a bowl game, and basketball had less than half the effect. Humphreys Mondello, 2005. Winning increased restricted donations, but not general ones. A restricted donation is one given for a specific purpose, in this case likely athletics only. An unrestricted donation is one that the university can use for anything. They stated further that the change is small enough compared to the normal donation level that its effect is insignificant. A second study found the same effect. Winning increased restricted donations, but not unrestricted ones. In summary, some studies find that winning does increase alumni donations. Others find no relationship. Where there is an effect, it's a small one, like a 7% rise in donations, and it stems from a massive achievement, like a bowl game or championship. Alabama has won the most football championships in the modern era. Their first title was in 1925, and Bama won 16 times overall in 95 years. But they've paid for their football teams all 95 years. If donations are the justification, is this a good investment? The problem, as some university presidents have pointed out, is that revenues are variable, but costs are fixed. So if you're not winning, it's not just athletics that's losing, it's the whole school. Even former NCAA employees agree that the link between athletic success and donations is a myth, because when the athletic department raises funds, it's not for the school, it's for themselves.
Unless maybe you're just in it for the money.
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 I'm going to say money.
Now, alumni donation is the commercial justification. Athletics departments are also thought to provide academic benefits to a school in the form of increased applications. This time, the research is a little more consistent. Murphy and Trandell, 1994. An increase in wins increases applications the following year. Another study found applications increased if your team had a Heisman nominee. Toma and Cross, 1998. A basketball or football championship increased applications for up to 3 years. However, it's unclear if that increases the quality of applicants. Pope and Pope, 2008. Football can increase applicants, but basketball consistently does not. Bomber and Zimbalist, 2019. Successful football program leads to more applicants, but no change in quality. For our final study, let's go a bit deeper. Kip, 2007. Studied the University of Florida. In 2006, the Gators made history as the only university to ever win both football and basketball championships in the same season. It was the most historic college football athletics accomplishment, and to this day, no one else has even come close. The following year, they had an 8% increase in applicants. Just 8%. For the most historic accomplishment in the history of college sports. Now look at this headline for the same Florida University in 2018. Nearly an 18% increase in applicants, a school record for its entire history. How? Innovation, making it easier to apply to the school. An innovation led to more than twice the increase in applicants Florida got from a historic athletic achievement, and it didn't cost hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for coaches, players, or stadiums. Overall, studies consistently found that successful athletics led to more applicants, yet several researchers still questioned whether the investment was worth it. One question remains. Did winning translate to better students enrolling at universities? Here we look at the effect of athletics on the quality of students at a school. McCormick and Tinsley, 1987, looked at 150 schools and found that those with large athletic programs tend to also have students with higher SAT scores. However, in true chicken and egg fashion, there was no causal relationship established. One could just as easily see that data and argue that high SAT scores lead to larger athletics programs. Again, McCormick and Tinsley, 1990, this time backed up by Bremer and Kessering, 1993, and Zimbalist in 2001. All found that athletic success leads to more applicants, but not better students. Cox and Roden, 2010, no relationship between athletic success and academic ranking. McDermott, 2018, same finding. Overall, there is no absolute consensus behind any of these questions. The best we can say is that for the very greatest athletics accomplishments, there might be a few more donations, there are a few more applications, and there probably isn't any benefit to student quality. So far, our questions about the benefit of college sports have been at the institutional level. But what about the benefit to the athletes themselves?
No, I don't think college athletes are given enough time to really take advantage of the free education that they're given.
A free education with an asterisk. See, Richard Sherman is one of the best possible sources on the value of a college education. He graduated high school with a GPA worthy of top-tier schools, then went on to attend Stanford and play for their football team. Unlike most college stars, Sherman actually stuck around and graduated before entering the NFL. He wasn't just an athlete, he took studies seriously and embodied what the NCAA preaches when they use the term student-athlete. So what's a genuine student-athlete mean when he says there isn't enough time?
An athlete on a campus is a full-time job. The NCAA rules say it's only supposed to be 20 hours a week. But if you go on a road trip, they only count the time you're on the floor.
The rules enforced by the NCAA are stringent, technical, and frankly, easily circumnavigated. The technical definition by the NCAA provides schools with 20 hours per week that they can schedule for a student-athlete. But how many college athletes do you know that only put 20 hours a week into their sport? It takes about 2.5 hours including breaks to get through a football game. But unlike the fans, the athletes don't just show up. They stretch beforehand, adjust the pads, go over the game plan. They have practice every day that week and warm-ups for that, maybe a meeting with the head coach, a chat with the assistant coach, weight training, skills training, team nutritionist, memorize plays, team meetings, team dinner, team party. Oh, did I mention these guys have class too? That this whole sports thing is supposed to be part-time with a full-time class schedule? The idea of someone going to school on a scholarship to be a student and just shoot some hoops on the side is a 100-year farce. But that doesn't really matter because
on scholarship, they pay for your room and board, they pay for your education, but to their knowledge, you're there to play football. You're not on scholarship for school. And it sounds crazy when a student athlete says that, but those are the things coaches tell them every day.
Less than 2% of D1 college football players go pro. That means the education athletes receive is the entire value that they leave with. Yet they're not given the time to pursue it because colleges don't benefit financially from athletes that graduate with top degrees. They benefit from winning.
Winning.
And winning takes a lot of time.
The truth is, being a college football player these days means a year-round cycle of practice, weightlifting, and off-season workouts.
But universities don't stop there when it comes to not educating athletes. As a matter of fact, the athletic scholarship is far from the good that it is perceived to be.
What they get out of it. Because
Okay.
remember, a scholarship is not a degree.
Right.
A scholarship is an opportunity to a degree.
An opportunity to a degree. What's that mean? Well, as it turns out, the scholarship system that grants athletes their education heavily favors the university.
The player signs the letter of intent, binds them to the school. So the player was bound, but the school wasn't bound to the player. You can run a player off anytime you want, still can.
It used to be that universities were not even able to offer student athletes any more than a one-year scholarship, though many athletes sign up for a 4-year commitment.
First of all, it's not a 4-year commitment. It never has been. The school doesn't make a 4-year commitment to a player. They can bounce the player anytime they want. But up until a few years ago, you couldn't make a 4-year commitment. It was a 1-year renewable.
This imbalance makes it extremely difficult for athletes to change their mind about their choice of university, though the schools can change their minds and do so often. Student athletes can have their scholarships revoked. It can happen for any reason, and it happens at surprisingly high rates. So while there is no incentive for the university to really educate an athlete, there's also a very strong incentive for athletes to spend more time on their sport than on their degree. And this has consequences for graduation rates.
Injured players can lose their scholarships. Graduation rates hover around 50% amongst the sports who are generating this money. And the NCAA is refusing to adopt the same concussion reforms that the NFL has adopted.
But this brings up a challenge for universities within the NCAA system. How do you keep athletes eligible while forcing them to spend so much of their time on the field or in the gym? Their solutions are mixed.
Getting kids into schools that have no business being in those schools in the first place, and then propping them up artificially through shaky majors and paper classes in order to get them a degree so it doesn't hit their APR. That's a quality education?
D1 athletes for basketball and football are more valuable than athletes playing soccer or tennis to a university. When colleges recruit the football and basketball players, they are willing to drop grade requirements a lot to get them. The result? Guys who have no business being in college at their current classroom level. The college then has another challenge, keeping a student eligible in college who struggled in high school. The result? tactics universities have come up with to bypass NCAA regulations on eligibility, some of which are mentioned on that herd clip. First, an easy major, and some very easy paper classes. The decision these institutions are making have far-reaching consequences in a person's life. If a university is going to take a player that struggled academically in high school, it is incumbent upon those universities to actually educate them. As CNN reported in 2014, they often don't.
A CNN investigation reveals a startling number of college athletes cannot read above grade school level.
According to that 2014 report, based on hundreds of athletes at dozens of D1 universities, between 7 and 18% of revenue sport athletes read at an elementary school level. Some of these students scored between 200 to 300 points on the SAT critical reading test, which doesn't sound too bad until you consider the lowest score isn't 0, it's 200. And the national average, not the college average, the national average is 500. Maximum score is 800. A professor at Oklahoma found that 10% of the revenue sport athletes there read below a 4th grade level. Behind those statistics are real people that really struggle if they don't make it professionally in their sport. Their stories can be hard to hear about. Dexter Manley played for Oklahoma State before getting into the NFL in 1981. In 1989, he testified before Congress that he was functionally illiterate and had been throughout his entire 4 years in college. Yet despite not being able to read, he remained academically eligible all 4 years in college. What does that tell you about the classes that he was put into? In the 1980s, Kevin Ross played basketball at Creighton for 4 years. He scored a 9 out of 36 on the ACT. Mr. Ross eventually admitted to being illiterate, saying the only thing he could read when he was admitted was his own name and the name of the university. Dasmian Cathy played football for Memphis in 2011 and also remained academically eligible while nearly illiterate. The troubling part isn't just that universities took in athletes that clearly weren't ready for higher education. It's that they took in these students and then made no effort to educate them and no effort to prepare them for life after sports. Dexter Manley was fortunate enough to play in the NFL. After 4 years of Creighton, Kevin Ross worked as a janitor in his old school. Dasmian Cathy never graduated and never went pro. These three are far from alone, and if the research is to be believed, there are thousands of other struggling athletes right now that won't get the help they need. Instead, they'll be rubber stamped through school as long as they continue to provide value in their sport.
They can't read, and there are no remedial classes. What's the option? To cheat?
The other option is to cheat.
In that CNN expose, reporter Santa Ganem and former UNC professor Mary Willingham stood on campus at the University of North Carolina. In 2012, it was the center of the largest academic scandal in the history of college sports. It represented everything wrong with not only the way academics is handled by university athletic departments, but how the NCAA polices scandals. It all started with a single professor. Mary Willingham blew the whistle on an academic scandal that had been in place for nearly 2 decades, in which mostly student athletes took paper classes that never met and only required a single paper to pass. Here is an example of one of the final papers submitted to a paper class. The professor teaching the class should probably be happy it was an original. Part of the scandal was a database of old papers created for student athletes so they didn't have to write their own. After the scandal was exposed, the university response was threefold. First, kill the messenger. In this case, the messenger was their own professor, but that didn't stop UNC and its fans from using every opportunity to discredit, threaten, and harass her. She eventually resigned over a demotion and pressure from fellow UNC officials. Second, create finding. Make your own friendly investigation, because if we're going to have to deal with this scandal, we can at least find something to blame it on that won't hurt our athletics programs or open us up to lawsuits and federal investigations. The problem is UNC's fake classes had existed for almost 2 decades, and any reasonable person can assume that dozens of administrators and officials had a hand in creating or perpetuating it. That takes me to the third response: find a scapegoat. In this case, not one single college coach or athletics administrator was found to be associated with the scandal. When the dreaded NCAA investigation came to pass, they decided to do what they saw as necessary: nothing. They went after players that the university itself guided into those classes.
The NCAA decided not to punish UNC. It went after athletes like McAdoo, who lost his spot on the team, eventually dropping out.
That should tell us something about how collegiate athletic scandals are handled. The NCAA doesn't like punishing schools, it'll hurt their bottom line. They prefer punishing players. Colleges don't like punishing athletes or head coaches, that will hurt their chances of winning. They prefer punishing assistants. The reason for both is to concentrate blame on a single scapegoat so that these big organizations can claim it was a single bad apple instead of a rotten tree. The scapegoats tend to be people that are perceived as easily replaceable, which is why not one single person tied to the athletic department went down during the fake classes scandal. UNC still insists that famed basketball coach Roy Williams knew nothing about the paper class system, something one of his former star players says is a lie.
How much do you think Roy Williams knew about the paper class system?
I think he knew 100%.
We call these places institutions of higher education. Yet when push comes to shove, it's the athletics department needs that become the sacred cow. UNC decided to engage in a huge number of rule changes to address the problem, but listen to what the professor they fired had to say about them.
Say that we made 120 changes, which you can make all the changes you want, but if you're still not meeting students where they're at as an educator and bringing them along so that they can have success in the classroom, then those changes are all for nothing.
Educating is exactly what UNC has been routinely failing to do for large numbers of these athletes, and they're not the only school willfully failing to do so. Minnesota basketball, 1999. An academic advisor and secretary did over 400 assignments for 18 student athletes from 1994 to 98. An investigation found that a coach went office to office, intimidating instructors into giving passing grades to basketball players. Syracuse, 2005. Athletic staff did coursework for athletes. Florida State, 2007. 61 student athletes in 10 different sports were involved in a cheating scandal facilitated by school officials. Here's the kicker with that case. An academic tutor who had helped athletes complete classwork was not only fired, but received a legal order from the NCAA that made her effectively unhireable anywhere in the country. Remember who the preferred targets are. Low-level people that are easily replaceable and can't fight back. University of North Carolina, 2010. A tutor wrote papers for football players. UNC in 2012. Paper classes. Southern Mississippi, 2016. Athletic staff did assignments for recruits and graduate assistants were paid to do hundreds of courses for athletes. University of Louisiana at Lafayette, 2016. A football coach bribed a testing center to falsify test scores for recruits. University of Missouri, 2019. The NCAA found that a tutor did online classes for at least 12 athletes to keep them eligible. Mississippi State, 2019. A tutor did courses for 10 football and basketball players. From 2014 to 2016, an additional half dozen or so universities committed academic misconduct, and another 20 were investigated for similar violations. Remember question number 1. What is the purpose of universities? Academic fraud is a widespread issue. Beyond what I listed, there's Rutgers, Georgia, Texas Southern, Texas A&M. The list goes on. And as sports economist Andrew Zimbalist says, this is just some of the cases we know about. As with the segment on Rutgers, the real story is all the other schools that do the same things.
The nature of the charges brought by the federal government are deeply disturbing. The NCAA continued to say we have no tolerance whatsoever for this alleged behavior. Coaches hold a unique position of trust with student athletes and their families, and these bribery allegations, if true, suggest an extraordinary and despicable breach of that trust.
College sports has a weird history with financial fraud because there are very normal business practices that are unacceptable by NCAA guidelines and illegal under current U.S. law. Scandals have included players accepting a free tattoo, a friendly discount, posing for a charity calendar, and illegal dunking. The NCAA has rules against any kind of gift or reward for players stemming from their D1 athlete status, so it cracks down on those tiny infractions to set examples and discourage larger ones. And the punishments disproportionately target players. Real scandals aren't players accepting free tattoos or giving signed jerseys to a restaurant for free meals. Real scandals typically involve alumni boosters, this very strange group of obsessive, wealthy graduates that probably give more money to athletic departments than actual charities. Scandals like large cash bribes, like booster Logan Young paying $150,000 to a high school coach in 1999 so Alabama could score a recruit. Scandals like Miami Hurricanes booster Nevin Shapiro providing cash, cars, yacht trips, jewelry, and prostitutes to 18 and 19-year-old Miami football players. Universities make an effort to self-police when these issues arise in order to avoid harsher penalties by the NCAA. But why? Why does the NCAA police its golden geese so energetically? A lot of it stems from the history of the organization, which we'll get into later. But the larger reason is to avoid investigations by the government. Because once state or federal investigations get underway, the NCAA has no control over what they may find and to what extent the brand of the NCAA will be harmed. They conduct their own investigation not to find wrongs, but to bury them.
What are you doing? I'm burying you.
In just the last few years, we've seen how massive an impact federal investigations can have.
This morning, the NCAA rocked by what the FBI is calling a massive corruption scheme, uncovering the dark side of hoop dreams.
All the presidents right now that are saying integrity, integrity, integrity. We've had coaches that were exposed in federal wiretaps that came out in federal court in New York.
Coaches at some of the nation's top programs soliciting and accepting cash bribes.
The college basketball scandal stems from agents bribing college coaches to steer players towards certain sports agencies as well as big-time brands like Adidas, who paid coaches to convince players to sign with the brand. And it wasn't localized corruption that the NCAA could lay at the feet of one assistant during an internal probe.
The FBI probe into NCAA basketball recruiting corruption is identifying Duke, Carolina, Texas, Kentucky, Michigan State, USC, Kansas, so Clemson, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisville, Wichita State, doesn't surprise me, Xavier.
That was an enormous and completely unsurprising list of schools. It was many of the top basketball competitors in the nation, and one of the main complaints of the accused when they went before the judge was unfair treatment, because they viewed their own actions as commonplace within the sport. The NCAA, as well as some programs, tried their best to say this was just another case of a few bad apples. Yet the accused in this case, like countless others in college sports, often defend themselves by saying everyone's doing it. This was a huge case that opened a lot of people's eyes to college sports corruption, and it wasn't even the biggest scandal the feds dug up.
The elaborate scheme allegedly involved fake athletic credentials, photoshopping pictures, cheating on standardized tests, and some parents spending upwards of $6 million in bribes.
Some were even accused of faking disabilities, faking ethnicity so that their children could get special privileges while taking the test, all to get their kids into these top-tier schools.
Colloquially known as the celebrity admissions scandal. From 2011 to 2018, $25 million in bribes were paid to college officials and testing associates. The FBI released a criminal complaint following an extended investigation involving cooperating witnesses and recorded phone calls. On screen is the actual document, which can be found at the link indicated here, saying the FBI has probable cause to believe defendants conspired to 1. Bribe college entrance exam administrators to facilitate cheating on college entrance exams. 2. To bribe varsity coaches and administrators at elite universities to designate certain applicants as recruited athletes or as other favored candidates, thereby facilitating admission to those universities. And 3. To use the facade of a charitable organization to conceal the nature and source of the bribe payments. Now, the most interesting part of those three, and the most relevant to our discussion here, is bribing varsity coaches and administrators to facilitate admission. They're not admissions officers, yet coaches and athletic administrators were found to be powerful enough to get the students in. They bribed the coaches and administrators despite the fact that in some cases the applicants did not ever play the sport they were recruited to play. In simpler terms, this was a lot of very wealthy parents bribing their way into schools their kids didn't belong in. They did it by contributing money to a fake charity, which also allowed the parents to write the amount of their fake donation off from taxes, and then the next fraud would begin. But where that money trickled to and how these kids got in is the most interesting part of the scandal. William Singer created a fake charity to front bribes, and his exact methods are even more disturbing. At Georgetown, Yale, and UCLA, coaches took bribes per student. We're talking $250,000, $300,000, $500,000. Nearly $1 million to get a single applicant in. These athletes were accepted even if they hadn't played the sport they were recruited for. A student bribed into USC had posed as a lacrosse player even though the school had no lacrosse team. Another applied as a football lineman despite weighing less than 150 pounds. Their athletic histories were faker than their Tinder bios. In the end, 10 coaches were charged with getting these fake athletes into schools. But why coaches? Because it was the easiest way to successfully get these kids in without drawing too much attention. And it was a great deal for the coaches too. Get paid anywhere from $250,000 to almost $1 million to continue doing your job. Another surprising element of college athletics that this investigation revealed was that it's not just football and basketball coaches that can get students into school. College athletics has gotten so big and so bloated that the coaches arrested coached soccer, volleyball, tennis, sailing, a sailing coach. William Singer and many of these parents are now looking at decades in prison. Operation Varsity Blues is a perfect example of why the NCAA cracks down on school scandals. If they had been able to handle this with an internal investigation, they could have controlled what information was released, when, and if they made their investigation public at all. As Operation Varsity Blues has shown us, coaches have gained so much power over admissions that even a sailing coach can force an applicant through if enough money is on the line. A university investigation is tainted by incentive, protect the brand of the university. But the same goes for the NCAA, which is why during the fake classes scandal, they decided to punish players at UNC, not the school. Because when you punish the players, you can pretend that this was a mistake by an individual. But when you punish the school, you admit something systemic is going on. The FBI has an incentive too. Make arrests. Find the people that broke the law, and most importantly, see how far down the rabbit hole goes. That's their brand, and that is exactly what the NCAA is terrified of. The last thing they want is to have a government agency find out just how much universities get away with under NCAA policing, which, as we've talked about, almost exclusively targets individuals instead of organizations. The ruthless punishments they dish out on players, the exploitation, the rigid structure, the basic unfairness, the organization we know today had a beginning. And it began with Walter Byers.
Years ago, Walter Byers, who you remember, he was the president when you and I were in school.
Mm-hmm.
So he and ruled with an iron fist. I mean, it was back when the NCAA was basically run by one man.
In the first decade of the 1900s, football was a vicious sport. Forget what you see today. The biggest hits of 1900 ended with severed spines and fractured skulls. Defenses stopped players with flying elbows, and nobody wore pads or helmets. Banning the sport entirely was often discussed due to dozens of deaths and hundreds of serious injuries. Entering into the 20th century, a video game on football would have looked more like the Blood Bowl than Madden. Then President Theodore Roosevelt, who loved football, held a meeting to save the sport from the worrywarts who wanted their children alive.
Foosball. You playing the foosball behind my back?
So an organization was made to create rules, and it became known as the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Over the decades, they created more rules, began to address things like cheating, recruiting violations, other modern problems we're very familiar with today. But there was always a lingering question asked within the NCAA and all the colleges they sought to control. Are they actually allowed to do this? Do they have any real power over universities? What's to stop a school from saying, no, who are you to investigate us? We don't agree with your punishment, so we're not doing that. And there was a constant power struggle between the organization and the schools it wanted to govern. Then Walter Byers took the helm. His career as the top executive of college sports was known primarily for two things: setting new standards of control and punishing all infractions big and small. Byers also formalized the bedrock of college sports: amateurism.
Amateurism, as defined by the NCAA, is crucial to preserving an academic environment in which acquiring a quality education is first priority.
With a firm ethical code that strictly states benefits to players is detrimentalized to their well-being.
The elusively defined system that maintains the unpaid status of players. The same amateurism that saves schools money and allows some college coaches to be better paid than their professional counterparts. But perhaps the biggest money saver Byers was ever able to produce happened early in his tenure, when the court system of the United States was asked to answer a question that has been challenged time and time again. Are they students or are they athletes?
If they get injured, a whole host of other problems can emerge. Fun fact, the very first executive director of the NCAA stated that he crafted the term student-athlete in the 1950s explicitly to avoid workers' comp for injured athletes.
Student-athlete. And it was because the NCAA was fighting workers' compensation claims when players were getting injured. and that's where it was headed, that they were going to have to pay workers' comp. Right. So by using this term student athlete and, you know, saying they're students, not employees and all this other stuff, they were able to work their way out of it.
A number of players over the decades has been badly injured, paralyzed, or died playing football. In 1957, Fort Lewis football player Ray Dennison died after a serious hit on the field, and his family filed for workers' compensation. The NCAA and its iron-fisted leaders saw the writing on the wall. If these athletes are eligible for workers' compensation, not only will that cost our organization and universities a ton of money, but that makes them employees rather than students. Then not only would college sports have to pay for their injuries, but they'd also have to pay athletes as employees. The answer? Student athlete. It's virtually guaranteed that anyone listening to this has heard that phrase before, which is a testament to how successful a move this was. It became the mantra for the whole organization and served as both a legal defense as well as a categorical title that is still in use today by most people that follow college sports. Following the student-athlete defense, Ray Dennison's family got nothing when he died. Neither did Kent Waldrep, nor many athletes that have been seriously injured, maimed, paralyzed, or killed. When the NCAA won the case against Ray Dennison, a precedent was set, and the decision was based partly on not being under a contractual obligation to play football, and partly because the school was not in the football business, and therefore did not benefit from the games. Back in 1954, at tiny Fort Lewis College, that might have been true. But compare that reasoning to today's college sports environment. Recruits sign contracts to play their sport in exchange for a mostly free education. That's a contractual obligation. Coaches can take away that scholarship for any reason. Sounds a lot like getting fired, doesn't it? But they're not legally employees. And in the 1984 Regent decision, Supreme Court struck down Walter Byers' control of football TV contracts as an illegal restraint on trade that harmed universities. Sounds like they're in the football business to me. And remember the financial section at the beginning. Billions of dollars are made and spent by D1 conferences. There's no way of knowing how the Ray Dennison case would be decided in today's hyper-commercialized environment. But the massive scandals that have continually rocked the NCAA for decades, and have actually gotten worse over time, have begun to change people's opinions on how the collegiate system should be run. One of those people, his name is Walter Byers. That's right, the very same man that built the system wanted to tear it down. Walter Byers became the modern Victor Frankenstein, hating the system he created to the point of becoming its most important critic in the 1990s. In 1995, he published a memoir that heavily critiqued both the NCAA and the entire amateur collegiate model. Between that book and similar speeches, he has said a neo-plantation mentality exists on college campuses, that a coach owns an athlete's feet and the college owns their body, that the NCAA is hypocrisy, that it is an illegal cartel, a nationwide money laundering machine, and that players should be paid. That was in 1995. Post-2010 was the largest sports spending increase ever. Fake classes scandals. Every single accusation Byers made in 95 is worse today, not better. Byers had a late life turnaround, and he can't be held responsible for all the corruption embedded into the organization, but he is absolutely accountable for creating the guise of amateurism.
If amateurism did not exist as we know it today in college sports, there would not be room for the shady black market that now exists.
There aren't many industries, probably none, where a group of nonprofits pull in billions in revenues every year. The most unfortunate part is that nobody, not the black market that pays them, not the NCAA, not the university, and not the coach, is looking out for these players. It's the players that get punished when they play, get injured, and lose a scholarship. It's the player that gets punished if they don't play and lose a scholarship. It's the player that's punished when they take a paper class the university pushed them into. The black market that's developed around amateurism is a correction that's developed to address a serious imbalance in college sports. The true correction, one that wouldn't cost students and taxpayers money or lead to ballooning debt, is to return universities to their original mission: education. The final reform: eliminate American collegiate sports. It's not as radical as it sounds. Most countries in the world have institutions of higher education. America is the only country to have sports so commercialized, so entrenched, so closely tied to education. Oxford and Cambridge don't build billion-dollar stadiums for their soccer teams, or pay head coaches over $10 million a year. Neither do universities in Paris, Munich, Moscow, Beijing, Seoul, Delhi, Cairo, Accra, or Buenos Aires. This is a uniquely American experiment, one that students and taxpayers help fund and that professional sports leagues, the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, MLS, use as feeder programs by drafting the best of college sports. But why should students and taxpayers be on the hook for policies that benefit athletic departments and pro sports leagues? We shouldn't, and we don't have to be. I have too many friends and family and know too many people across America that live for their local team. It goes beyond the gear or a favorite player. It goes even deeper than winning or losing. At its very best, sports events are where you get together with people and center your experience around something that unites you and your neighbors. Well, unites you against the locals of the other team. But there's no reason the Crimson Tide, Tigers, Longhorns, Buckeyes, or Wolverines have to disappear. As we now know, there are roughly 20 college football teams that break even in profit. There are a few basketball teams that come close. With proper profit incentives in place, many of these teams have the popularity and sales to cut administrative fat and establish payrolls. There are a number of different ways to do this based on examples worldwide. Here are the 3 best ways that college sports can privatize. Option 1. The competitor. Form a professional league to rival the NFL monopoly like the Canadian Football League or XFL. There's a great ESPN 30 for 30 episode on the XFL and how, despite its failure, the NFL adopted a bunch of changes the XFL had made.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the XFL!
With the football market being so massive, and the supply being almost completely monopolized, the potential for success is there. For the NBA, there actually was basketball competition for decades until a merger in 1976. Basketball is so big that the Big Three League took off, headlined by former stars and young prospects, and that's just 3-on-3 ball. There's no reason an alternative basketball league can't be financially competitive today. Option 2, the feeder league.
The NBA's thinking, why not spend more money on a developmental league? And that's what they're doing.
I don't know. I know, first of all, we have every NBA team has to have their own farm system. And I think we're almost there, but we're not quite there yet.
Join the NFL and NBA, similar to Major League Baseball's minor leagues, still taking on high school recruits that can get drafted or signed to professional teams. This already exists for the NBA in the form of the G League, though as LeBron suggested, there's not a farm team for each NBA team yet. College basketball programs that have the ability to support themselves could fill that gap, like Duke or UNC becoming the farm team to the Charlotte Hornets. Option 3, the Premier League model. Anyone who's played FIFA or watches the English Premier League knows what happens when a team finishes in the bottom 3 in the league. You drop down, otherwise known as relegation, and the 3 best teams in that league can move up. In this case, it could mean Alabama, LSU, or Clemson moving up to the big leagues. Right now in the NFL, bottom finishers are rewarded with top draft picks, which can actually disincentivize performing well. But what if those 20 or so college football teams formed a division under the NFL, akin to the football leagues in the United Kingdom? The best players of the new system could still get signed by NFL teams, and the threat of demotion would end tanking once and for all. In this scenario, you could legitimately see the Alabama Crimson Tide face off against the New York Giants. Good luck getting the Jaguars or Jets to agree to this system, though. Tanking is a huge problem in the NBA, where teams have sacrificed multiple years of players' and coaches' careers in order to pursue the chance of getting a hyped prospect. Demotions for tanking teams and promotions for the winner of March Madness, for example, could end the practice once and for all. No matter what path is ultimately taken, the biggest college football and basketball teams can still have a future. All this is to say that the organization of college teams into the professional sports world is not only possible, it's potentially lucrative. There are even benefits for the colleges beyond the obvious, no longer needing to divert billions of dollars away from education. These teams are popular under their current brand. Every college basketball fanatic knows the Duke Blue Devils, which is why it may be imperative that any team seeking to exist in the sports market will need to negotiate with their schools for brand continuity. In such a circumstance, money from sports may actually make its way back to schools for, in some cases, the first time in their history. There are advantages to the elimination of college sports for colleges first and foremost. There are also potential advantages for teams as they can expand beyond the limitations of nonprofit status to make more money. Yet it's the players that stand to gain the most from the elimination of college sports and emergence of legitimate competitor leagues. Sports scholarships are unique to the American higher education system. In Europe, being a top player doesn't get you into university, but it can get you into a professional youth program where you can play professionally as young as 14. These youth programs directly connected to professional teams are seen as some of the biggest reasons European men's soccer is so successful on the national stage compared to American men's soccer. And it's not just that sport. The same system has been adopted to basketball players since it began gaining popularity. Players like Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, Luka Doncic,
pulls up, three-pointer.
Kristaps Porzingis all played professionally at young ages and then got drafted to the highest levels of the sport in America. The NCAA, meanwhile, is getting less popular with players coming out of high school, and that's part of a historical trend. Brandon Jennings, Emmanuel Mudiay, LaMelo Ball, Mitchell Robinson, R.J. Hampton, Terry Armstrong, Kenyon Martin Jr., Anthony Simons, Darius Baisley, Jalen Leck, Terrence Ferguson. Some of them are former stars, some future. More importantly, they all decided to skip the NCAA in favor of basketball in Australia, China, Latvia, the G League, with the plan of entering the NBA. But they didn't have to give up 1 to 4 years of making money to do so. They didn't have to split their time with an education that coaches viewed as a rival rather than the primary motive of the player.
I've always heard the narrative they get a free education, but you guys are not bringing me on campus to get an education. You guys are bringing me on it to help you get to a Final Four or to a national championship.
Outside the NCAA, they could just be professionals. Here's another study on the percent of league revenue that student athletes get. Less than 7% compared to roughly 50% for professionals. Overall, there are viable options for profitable programs, and eliminating college sports as a nonprofit that doesn't pay players would go a long way towards reining in the skyrocketing cost of advanced education. But there are certainly downsides to eliminating college sports entirely. What about the student athletes that take classes seriously and excel academically, like Richard Sherman or Andrew Luck? They can get into college on their academic merits. What about other sports? Wrestling, soccer, lacrosse, track, volleyball, sailing. They don't exist without university support. Students with scholarships in those sports would be at a loss. Yet at many schools, those sports are already getting cut, while the same universities cutting them pour more resources into football and basketball. Additionally, the education of someone on a soccer scholarship is only free to the student getting the scholarship. Guess who pays for that? Your fellow students. Sports that can't cover costs get bailed out by academics. It's an unfair system with or without basketball and football. Education at the highest level should give out scholarships for the best students regardless of athletic talent. In the end, if colleges are going to charge some students full tuition while charging others nothing, let it be because they were brilliant in the classroom, not brilliant on the field. In summary for college sports, we know that they cost anywhere from tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. We know they don't sustain themselves. We know that universities constantly take money from your education to fund these sports teams. That coaches get raises when professors don't. That universities have taken on enormous debt, and that the justifications for all this doesn't hold up in the face of research. Academic fraud has been rampant among top-tier athletics programs. The amateur collegiate model has made it distinctively vulnerable to black market activity, in this case paying players, their families, or coaches, in order to steer athletes towards a certain school, agency, or sportswear company. The power athletic directors and coaches have in the admissions process has made them targets of national bribery schemes. No other country in the world has unified universities and athletics like America has. So when viable alternatives exist that would improve both organizations and lives of players, we can do the reasonable thing and eliminate college sports and the NCAA. Because if the original leader of the NCAA, the man who made the organization what it is today, can recognize its flaws, can you? Recruiting had become corrupt, professionals replaced amateurs, education was being neglected, and commercialism reigned. Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, 1929.